So thank you so much for the introduction, and I've now got 25 minutes to cover 200 years, which is going to be a bit of a tall order, but I will do my level best. So I'm going to set the scene for this conference by some context over a couple of hundred years, or even more actually, but I will keep it sharp to the point so that we can get on with the really important business. So first of all, herbal leys. What are they exactly? Well, they could be called many things. Multi-species swards, diverse leys. These are the sorts of things that we're commonly speaking about. I'm going to call them herbal leys for the purposes of this presentation, and this is what they look like. This is a dairy cow, of course, grazing through some legume and herb-rich sward, as you can see. And what we actually have in here are deep-rooting plants, many different types of plants. Typically, you could have 15, 16, 17 different species in a mixture called a herbal ley. Typically, grasses that would be included in these would be the deeper rooting grasses, cocksfoots, timothys, meadowfescues, that sort of thing, but of course also the ryegrasses. And herbal leys do encompass many things. These are the 4 key agricultural grasses that are used in the UK. There are plenty of other species too, and some farmers have been experimenting with those. Key legumes, of course, some of the short-term, fast-growing legumes like yellow trefoil, but also the key red and white clovers, the true clovers, the deep-rooting lucerne, sandfoins, birdsfoot trefoil, and there are others too. But again, these are the key species that people commonly refer to in these mixtures. And finally, the herbs which are used are typically just these 5: ribwort, plantain, chicory, parsley, burnet and yarrow. And these, of course, have properties that bring up minerals from deeper in the soil profile to transfer to animals. Now, I know many of you listening today do know this, so I'm not going to go into any more detail about what they are, but these are the species that I'm going to try and include briefly in this talk. First, though, let me take you back a couple of thousand years, or just over a couple of thousand years, to Cato, who said that farmers should have a low cost of production and be a seller, not a buyer. Now, I'll tell you what, I don't think that, he's so far-sighted, this guy, writing in De Rustica about his view on how farmers should be. It is so true today that farmers have got a very high cost of production, and that when they sell, they get a low price. And perhaps we should be thinking about reversing this whole trend. So as we start here with Cato, let's move in now a couple of thousand years ahead, to 200 years ago, roughly, to Arthur Young. And Arthur Young, for those of you that don't know him, was an interesting character. He was employed by the government, effectively, to write down his experiences of agriculture across the whole of England, Wales. He even went into Ireland and into France. And he wrote about county agriculture in a really interesting way. And in those days, of course, there was no public transport, there was no vehicles as such, so he was riding around on his horse, and he managed to record all these things as he went round. And I found some of the things he wrote really, really interesting. So, for example, I learnt about using burnet in East Anglia as part of a forage crop. I learnt about including buckwheat into mixtures from him in order to act as a nurse crop. And we may know these days, of course, that buckwheat's really good at making phosphate available, but in those times it was anecdotal. It was learnt on the job, as by error, trial and error. So this is where I started researching, when I started to look around for information on these other agricultural species that were being used often in mixtures with other plants. Of course, about the same time, Charles Darwin was doing lots of work, and although he's not an agriculturalist proper, he was certainly telling farmers that, and writing down in the Origin of Species, that more plants together gave a fantastic over-yielding effect, and many agriculturalists picked up on that. Not least of which was Robert Elliot, who felt that having a farm up in the Scottish borders, which was becoming very difficult to see how it was profitable. He was wanting to develop a self-sufficient system. He was interested in building his soils and producing low-cost forage. He was faced at the time with high corn prices, high input prices in terms of fertilizers, and was determined to build his own self-sufficient system, which was based around ley farming. He wrote a wonderful book called The Clifton Park System of Farming, which I urge any of you to read if you haven't come across it. It is available. I think you could even get it online now. And it had a foreword by Sir George Stapleton, who was also very instrumental in just after Elliot's time. But Elliot was the first person that I could see that wrote this down, told you exactly how to do it, and his deep-rooting, humus-building lays, which were in the ground for 4 years, did make him self-sufficient. And going back to what Cato said, these self-sufficient systems should be and are cheaper to grow. And for a farmer like Elliot, who was struggling to compete on a biggish farm, he found this way of mixed farming, lays at the centre of the rotation, was the way to go. Plenty of other people followed him. William Lammon was one of those people. Oh, not this one again. William Lammon. My kids always take the mickey out of me when I put this one in. Not William Lamming, but what I meant was William Lammon, who was a Nottinghamshire farmer. He was on some sand land up in Nottinghamshire, who struggled. I mean, this is difficult land. I was when I was in the 1980s, when I was training, I worked up in Nottinghamshire on that land there, and I can tell you when it blowed, when the winds blew, this land blew away quite literally. The sand, it was like a desert in places. The sand would just blow off the top of the soil. And William Lammon was a brave farmer in many respects. He went to a farm. He took on a farm, a tenancy of a farm, and his father advised him not to farm it because it would ruin him. He said, there's no way you're going to make a job of that farm. Well, anyway, William Lammon was a determined man, and he proved his father, or wanted to prove his father, wrong. And so what he did was he had read Elliot's book, the Clifton Park Farming System, and William Lammon developed his own system of farming. And he simplified the mixtures that Robert Elliot was using. And he still had many species, mind, but he had roughly half the number of species. Now, he came up with a couple of lovely things. One is, he said it was like throwing money away to put ryegrass on dry land. And we all know why. These relatively shallow-rooting plants on sand just don't do anything. One, because there's no moisture, and two, obviously, because there's little fertility, especially in the way of nitrogen. So ryegrass wasn't for him. And he also said that the deep-rooting lays that he was using would be tickling the miners' ears below ground. And remember, this, going back in the day, this was a time when, Mrs. Thatcher's government, if you recall, those of you old enough, shut the mines down. And below the surface of Nottinghamshire, with all these wonderful people mining coal. And anyway, so his joke about tickling the miners' ears was true and resonated in those times. But what the thing to note is that these deep-rooting plants really did make a big difference to his style of farming. Now, another man that was, I think, very influential and interesting for us now in the scheme of Herbal Leys is Frank Newman Turner. He was a farmer based in Wiltshire, and he was very much thinking from the soil up. He was very much thinking around what effect would plants have on the health of his animals and ultimately on human health, the people that ate the food that was produced by his system. And I think he was a pioneer. I'm not sure exactly how he finished up, but I do know that he wrote some wonderful books at the time. I think he published 4 books, and they were all about how to grow and manage your livestock. He was a dairy farmer around these deep-rooting herbal lays. And he had a lovely term that he coined, and that was that the herbal lays were his vet, his feed supplier, and his manure merchant all in one. And I think that sums up the job really well, because he would have been spending money on all 3 of those items, fertilizer, animal feed, and of course vet and meds. And he didn't, and he was absolutely certain that the health came from the ground up. So he's a very good point of reference should you want to research further into this. Now, one man that everybody in grassland science knows, of course, is Sir George Stapleton. He was an ecologist by trade, I think a biologist, perhaps ecologist, stroke maybe, and he was the director, and perhaps best known for being director at the Welsh Plant Breeding Station at Aberystwyth, where he, I think, did a lot of work. But the thing about George Stapleton that I think is really important, is that he, at the heart of his thinking, felt that ley farming was the driver of fertility. And so in the Second World War, when he wrote this book, The Plough-Up Policy and Ley Farming, the thrust of what he was saying was that, the soil is key for fertility, and the fertility comes from leys. And so all of these people, in all their different ways, shapes and forms, were placing right at the centre of farming operations these leys. And the diverse leys in particular were the ones that were bringing the fertility. And the ley was definitely, if you read any of these accounts, was the most important bit of this rotation, more important than the cash crops. The cash crops, of course, were important for cash, but actually the farming system was dependent on the leys. And if you contrast that with today, where we have huge acreages of land without leys, in fact, I think the grass ley acreage is at its lowest levels as it's been for years. But all these agriculturalists believed that growing diverse leys was the solution to the problems that they experienced at the time. And those problems are no different now. So cheap cereal prices, imported cereals, holding the price of cereals down. High input costs, whether that's fertilizers or sprays or animal feed. And of course, soil fertility worries. And as we know, there's so much conflicting science around soil fertility, how bad it is, how quickly it's going to worsen or not. But fundamentally, as farmers, we've always had this fear of losing our soil's fertility. But these diverse leys are, I am sure, the solution to the problem. Now, coming up a little bit in time, I want to talk about the forage legume seeds, because I think forage legume seeds are an indicator of what has happened in farming. Now, this chart shows you a declining use of forage seeds, legume forage seeds, over a 40-year period, roughly from when I was born in the early 1960s to the end of the century. So think 40 years, think a declining line, and roughly an 80% decline. And these figures were collated by people like me as seedsmen, all seedsmen together, it's not just our figures, showing the reduction in the tonnage of seed sold for planting in the UK. And this tells you that from the 1960s to the end of the century, over a 40-year period, that legumes fell out of popularity. Now, many of us know this, but it is striking when you see these figures to see how they were once really underpinning farming, and now, well, at the end of the century, went to virtually nothing. Couple this with economic pressure as well. This is a statement that the NFU put out a while ago, but it just reminds us of how important the economic pressure is on farmers. And farmers are really driven and naturally by the need to make profit and to trade. And whilst we have to recognise that, we can understand completely why farmers are in a bit of a quandary as to which way they should go next. Think of nitrogen fertiliser prices, for example. The price of fertiliser has increased regularly over the first part of this century, and I'm not sure where nitrogen fertiliser prices are going, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility that as we become have less natural resources in terms of oil and gas, these prices are just going to increase. So one would assume that this is going to get more difficult and is not going to get any easier. So the options for farmers, of course, are to increase the production potential by intensifying and producing more, as I and many others have been taught to do, or to find a lower cost method of production. And that, for me, means using plants. Plants, of course, are able, as we've seen in previous generations, are able to find favour, if you like, with farmers who can use them. And I'll give you an example of a few of these now. So Lyndon Edwards here is an old friend of mine who I've known for a long time, but I remember roughly 20 years ago, he and I were speaking one day, and he said, I can't tell you how different things are now I'm using red clover. So Lyndon was using a lot of ryegrass, and he cut out his dependence on fertiliser and started to use red clover as part of his forage, and large amounts of it too. And he was struck by how little concentrate he needed to fatten lambs. Remember, bought-in concentrate is for all farmers really expensive, so it's a very important thing to note. Of course, it won't surprise you that this is just an example of work that was done actually by Vipon and Swift many years ago, but just shows you the difference in lamb growth rate between, say, a pure grass sward and one with clover. It's just very simple, but you can see the differences, and many of you I know this. But just let's remind ourselves how important and how easy it is to switch from one system to another. And one thing, of course, that's changed massively is our thoughts around climate. I think weather has always driven farmers. The rain and ruin have always been there for farmers as far back as I've ever read, and I don't think that's changed as such. But certainly in terms of resilience to any climate, whether it's a modern climate that we think of now changing, or a climate that we've lived with in this maritime situation that we've had for hundreds of years, it's really important to have resilience in your system. And these deep-rooting herbal leys have always, according to all people that have used them, given them that. And many people start by thinking about the soil and how they can produce forage in dry times, but it's also about coping with high levels of rainfall, enabling you to turn stock out, and also having good soil structure so that you can grow annual crops in too when required. But it's when you look below the ground, and about 20 years ago, again, when I was speaking to Lyndon Edwards, many of us were looking at what was happening to the root structure of plants. So a lot of the science had been revolving around yield, top growth, in other words, biomass yields and protein constants and things. But actually, it was many of us were fascinated by what was going on below the ground, and there was as much happening there as there was above ground. Of course, we still can't understand exactly all of it. But when we started to look at root structures and the way plants were behaving when moisture was unavailable, we started to see big differences. And one of the best examples of that was about 15 or 16 years ago when I met Rob Richmond. And Rob came to probably one of the driest farms in the Cotswolds, and it wasn't very far from where I lived. And he was a determined man to demonstrate how he could have a self-sufficient system where he could have a good dairy production system and sequester carbon. And Rob really did bring it all together. He changed his ryegrass system, which was highly dependent on nitrogen fertiliser and one big annual yield, most of which was preserved as silage, into an all year round grazing system with any excess taken off into the silage pit. But he did it really, really well, and a number of times I left that farm seeing dry, burnt-up Cotswold forages compared to his luxuriant growth of these wonderfully deep-rooting plants. And I think the other thing that Rob taught me was that you can get tremendous seasonal growth from this forage. And as we know, there's not, again, won't surprise many of you, but just bear in mind that, the grazing is by far the cheapest method of production and doesn't involve capital as such. And when you start to overlap the different grasses and the legumes and the herbs, you do get a really good 3-season production. And the excess can, of course, be conserved in the normal way. So many things are changing, and I think our thinking and our understanding have changed. And the introduction of equipment like this is sort of relatively low tech, I suppose, but just electric fencing, portable electric fencing that's cheap, that works, that's reliable, that can be used to keep livestock in, to mob graze things like Herbal Leys, to really get them functioning. And I know that there's going to be lots of discussions after this talk today, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But I do think that the modern knowledge that we have, the modern resources that we have, and the modern way we're thinking really does bring a lot of the lessons that we've learned from the past up to speed. So Newman Turner was particularly interested in animal health. And we know, for example, that with many of them, much of modern science showing us and explaining to us how bioactive compounds in certain plants like sandfoin and birdsfoot trefoil can have a huge effect, beneficial effects on ruminant production. You begin to see why these historical accounts were so important. They may have been anecdotal in many respects, but certainly they offer us first-hand experience from farmers that made loads of mistakes, I am sure, but they certainly realised that these combinations of plant species were really, really beneficial, and now science is proving that. So I think things are changing hugely on the way that we agriculturalists think around the future. Many people are concerned about the loss of biodiversity, and if you think about having more plant diversity in your rotation, no question at all, you're going to help biodiversity, generally speaking. So for me, it's about working alongside a natural system and incorporating other species into our forage crops, as opposed to having monoculture forage, which may be easy to manage in some respects, but certainly doesn't allow cohabitation of other species. DEFRA, of course, Natural England, of course, have been very instrumental in encouraging farmers into these systems, and GS4 is a very nice, relatively recent introduction to encourage farmers to plant different mixtures. And some of GS4, for example, is a very handsomely paid scheme, and many farmers have gone in. And once they go in, and what always surprises is pleasing to see is the fact they really like growing these mixtures, because they are very self-sufficient. We've seen quite a lot of farmers across the country. This is actually going back 5 years now, but this shows you where we noticed, and I say we, that's Cotswold Seeds noticed, farmers regularly buying these type of mixtures. All across the UK, it really interesting to me was that there were farmers pretty much in every part of the country, certainly where we were dealing, which is England, Wales, Scotland, and a little bit into Northern Ireland. And was really, I'm sure other seed merchants have done the same thing, so it's not just Cotswold Seeds. But it seems to me that when you see, this is 5 years ago, there's a lot more now, but when you see this happening, something's working. This isn't just the odd one or two people doing it, it's really working. So again, now I could update this chart, in fact I have, and there's a lot more on it now. So it's quite encouraging, and there's thousands of farmers with these mixtures. But the one thing that I always think is really interesting is, when you look for the scientific evidence as to whether or not these things work, whether it's protein content or carbon sequestration or biomass yield, whatever it is, and I know all this is coming up through the conference, what I want to just say at the beginning is that sometimes just seeing is believing. And we have a lot of people come to Farm Ed, which is where I spend some of my time these days, which is a demonstration farm looking specifically at issues around regenerative style farming, where everything starts with the soil. When you test these soils, you might see something on a loss on ignition test or a Dumas test or something like that to see what's happening with carbon. You might count the number of birds or pollinators or whatever it might be. You might look at a live weight gain in terms of animal production. But you've only got to dig it up, and you just have to touch it, feel it, smell it, and see it. And you are completely convinced that these sorts of systems work for farming now. And things have changed so rapidly in the last 20 years or so around how we perceive our farming systems. And I'm talking about not just the way animals fatten and produce on these plants, but also in the way that they allow other species, so biodiversity increases, and how they capture carbon into the soil in a really quick time way. So I think for me that this whole thing is very much of our time. So I hope you all don't mind me having brought it right up to date, but I think the historical lessons are there for us to see. When there's a problem, whether that be loss of soil quality, whether it be economic, whether it be animal health, a lot of the solutions in the past have come from diversity, and diversity in the Leys is key, because they are at the centre of the system. So I'll stop there, if I may, and I understand there's questions coming next.